Bon, mes chers amis, comme le silence se fait, que la...
Right, dear friends, we are about to start. Good morning, I'm Elisabeth Laville. I'm the director of a consulting company called Utopie, specialized for 25 years in supporting strategies for sustainable development. The issue today we're going to talk about, well, something fascinating, is convergence, which is necessary and potentially revolutionary between the digital transition and the energy transition. We have 4 speakers who are right into this subject, and I'm delighted. Yesterday I didn't manage to stick to the schedule, but we'll have 1 hour for the debate after the presentations with you. So I will briefly try to give you a few elements of context and the reasons why we picked this topic. The starting point, in fact, was the fact... I'm sorry, let me check my iPhone because I thought I had my notes on my iPad, but I ran out of battery, so I have to read on my iPhone, which is very small, on my knees, but I'm not checking my text messages or the tweets you might send on this fascinating debate. Anyway, so digital transition, well, basically, when it comes to innovation and so on, we saw it with a new French president. We talk a lot about startups, innovation, French tech, and so on and so forth. And rightly so, because in a way, this changes all in all sectors, in fact. And at the same time, we see that we cannot, I mean, if you look at the issue in details of sustainable development, you cannot think it's the magical solution to all economic problems or social problems and environmental problems. So in a way, you have to keep in mind that some of the NGOs, but not only, see in the digital revolution one of the manifestations of the fact that the development model is not sustainable. So it's a bit of a paradox, really. On the one hand, you have this digital sector which attracts a lot of innovators and entrepreneurs transforming all sectors and organizations and territories, which created the internet, the MOOC, and the free education for all, the Arab Spring, and peer-to-peer, and dematerialization, free software, and so on and so forth, and mobile phones, social networks, loads of amazing things which we use in our daily lives. But please keep in mind that also it's created servers which are very greedy in terms of energy, and an industry which weighs as much on the climate as air transport, and on the consequences, all kinds of consequences. That is to say that you try and solve some social or environmental problem with digital, but in fact you have an impact which is not only positive and sometimes higher than the positive impact that you have. For example, I mean, remote services which are supposed to replace transport, create new types of transport. It's not new. This was already the case with mobile phones. We thought people will travel less, and in fact, obviously, the more we develop telephone, the more transport were developed as well. What else? I mean, automation. I mean, we thought about AI and to fight against isolation for elderly people and bring them healthcare in isolated areas. But in fact, we realized that, yeah, on the one hand, obviously, it works, but on the other hand, it also reinforces isolation, and in fact, it has a negative impact on their health. And digital created negative impacts as well, but also, I don't know, the fact that kids are fascinated with screens. This disturbs their concentration capacities, and video games that foster violence and so on. There's a great report from the FIM, the New Generation Internet Foundation, published a year and a half ago or 2 years ago on transitions in general. And this report says something in particular which I thought was specifically clear and rather obvious and interesting for today's debate, which was that it said basically to do transition, you need a destination and a way. And then In fact, it says if you look at the digital transition and energy transition, you have the way, you see basically the next steps and what's making progress and so on. However, you cannot see the end, the destination towards you going towards better or worse. And some people think, AI is better or worse. So, on the other hand, other types of transition, and the energy transition in particular, and the ecological transition and demographic transition, are considered as obviously desirable because you know that the end goal is great. However, we're not really clear on how to get there. Obviously, it's the opposite. So we know where we're going, but we don't know how to go there. Whereas for the digital dimension, it's the other way around. So is it 1984 all over again or not? So what the report says is that there's a real interest, but it cannot happen if you don't decide you will do it. So there is interest in putting the digital transition to be used for other types of transition because you will have the destination and the way together. And this is what we're suggesting in this roundtable this morning, is to try and see how you can mix energy transition and digital transition and see how but it won't be done just like this overnight, because if you look at the startups in the French tech are not always responsible, they don't always integrate issues related to energy transition and responsibility, social responsibility in their DNA, not at all, most of the time, except if they're working specifically on doing so, or if they, if you don't work, if there's an end goal which is by definition social or economic, and the digital is only a tool. So how can you mix these two transitions? This is the issue for the roundtable this morning. And to present our speakers, rather than doing it myself, I would like each one of them to present in a couple of minutes and present briefly their organization, and maybe in one sentence saying how the organization is part of this thinking on transition in convergence between digital transition and ecologic or energy transition. We'll start with the second mic, Jack. So we'll start with you. Okay.
Bonjour.
Good morning.
Merci.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. It's great.
Merci aussi, Elisabeth.
Thank you to Elizabeth as well for this great introduction. I heard a new word, hyper greedy. I love it. It's like junk for the digital world. So anyway, my name is Jack Townsend.
I'm going to switch to English now, if that's okay. My French isn't that strong. So I'm a digital program manager, and I am a researcher for about 10 years now, and I specialize in sustainability applications of digital technology. I work with EcoSummit recently, which is Europe's largest conference for smart green startups, to connect with investors, such as impact investors, clean tech investors, in order to help them scale. Before that, I was doing a PhD, where I was trying to get a handle, trying to understand all these fascinating things, all these interesting startups that are in this space, trying to make the world a better place with digital technology. And I also organize a meetup group in London that's been running since 2012 called Clean Web, as in Clean Tech Meets Web, and brings together a similar community of in the East End of London, where we have the digital hub of people, technologists who really care about the planet.
Thank you, Jack. We're going to stay with English, and I'm going to hand my mic to Mikael.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. So I'm Miguel, Resource Efficiency Manager at Fairphone, and I was part of the founding team. Just 1 minute about Fairphone for people that don't know it. Fairphone is a B Corp, is a 70-people company in Amsterdam. We make smartphones, and that sounds weird, but we make smartphones. And we make smartphones as a way to inspire the whole industry on new solutions for the social and environmental problems that they go through. I'll focus on Fairphone 2 because I think it's a good example for today. Fairphone 2 is a highly repairable device. So our aim is to keep that device in the hand of customers as much as possible. If I wouldn't need to hold my microphone, I would show you, but I cannot do two things at the same time. But basically, Fairphone 2, you can just remove your screen in 10 seconds. Change your screen in 10 seconds. So if we're talking about the transition to digital, I have to say there is a lot of infrastructure that is needed for this transition, and we also need to look at that. At Fairphone, we focus on 4 topics. We focus on the origin of materials, so where are they mined, under what conditions, how they come in our supply chain. What are the traceability systems that we can use to make sure that they come from mines that help communities, not fund wars. We focus on working conditions also in the supply chain with some direct suppliers and some second-tier suppliers as well, where we find innovative solutions also for social issues in countries like China, for example. And then an example of that is our Worker Welfare Fund. I'll go to the end. We also focus on reuse and recycling, looking at, for instance, how much can you actually recycle from this infrastructure that we have in the world, mobile phones, for instance, where you learn that only 40% of the materials that are in are actually recoverable. So you better use them as long as possible. And the last topic that we focus on is on the design itself, and that fits back. There's quite a feedback loop from the other one. How can we design products that you can repair? How can you design products that can last longer, not shorter? How can you design software that makes those products also last longer, not shorter? And I would say the bottom line of all these topics we focus on is also transparency. So as a B Corp, we were born to actually change the industry. So everything that we do is online, so you can follow the good things and the bad things, and we hope that somebody listens on the other side and learns from it as well, from our mistakes. I'll just finish up saying that I'm very happy that yesterday, actually, Greenpeace put us on the top of electronics industries in terms of sustainability. So the report went out, and I think is I don't mean it so much for Fairphone, but I mean it also for B Corps and social enterprises, that we can definitely lead in some topics. We may not lead in every topic, but we have to lead in the topics that are important, that create the discussion and bring the change. Thanks.
Thank you very much. On passe à nos intervenants.
We'll switch to French speakers. Edouard, you have the mic. Good morning to all of you. Thank you for your invite. I'm the manager, director of GRDF, the gas distribution in France, that operates 200,000 kilometers on the French territory of network to bring gas to all users, basically, about 11 million clients using natural gas. And it's true that GRDF is totally both in this approach of a sustainable and responsible company with major actions on our own procedures to, for example, try and reduce everything that could lead to incidents with gas. So we spend €1 million every day to improve safety and networks to avoid these things. And there was a recent initiative that we took as well. For example, we tried and recover and recycle all the working clothes from our employees. And obviously, we do it with companies that try to insert workers. And with all the suppliers, a great part of what we do, we work with insertion companies as well that have more and more skills. And currently, I received suppliers a few weeks ago, and I was absolutely amazed to see that we're very, very, very far from the image we have of companies that are only focused to manual work. For example, there's one which is a major supplier for Airbus, and this is very important to see that when you want to do social responsibility, you can in fact go very far in terms of quality and employees and quality of products. And the second thing, the reason why I'm here this morning is that we are part of the energy transition as well. And for us, this means obviously aiming at having a world without carbon. So we try and do it because gas obviously produces far less CO2 than coal, for example. But also we have convinced that We have to have our consumers consume less, and we have pushed a lot of program in this field. We have helped all boiler manufacturers to design that, and we see an improvement of 30 to 50% between former boilers and current boilers. So it's not the final stop yet, but obviously it's the first step to use even less. And the second thing was to try and recover as much as possible in terms of waste and methane emissions. So we have methanization projects on the whole territory. We develop that, and we connect on a regular basis new methanization units. And we are very happy to see that gradually we are going towards gas in networks that will be circular economy and totally renewable. So this is a nice transition with my friend François Bezant. We're working together with them to make sure that by 2050 we can have a gas which will be 100% renewable in our network. Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. So François Moisan, I'm the director of the Agency for Energy Management. I believe that most of you know what it is. So we're one of the operators of the ecological and energy transition. So in fact, we're defined as having 3 different tasks or activities. We try and be precursors, and we support research and development in identifying low-level events and weak signals, and we take part in, well, currently we're in a phase of the transition where it's not, I mean, the whole society is moving, so we're part of it, and we try to create some levers so that most players can be committed to this transition, and we're defined as an expertise agency as well. We have experts that can assess and give opinion and advice to the government, but also to other players. So just to give you a bit of details regarding today's meeting. So with our activities, prospective activities, well, I mean, we do visions of what the energy transition would be by 2030 and 2050, and tomorrow we'll publish the results of our vision for 2030-2050 that was issued in 2012. So this will be a new expertise published tomorrow. So this means we need to take into account, obviously, the potential impact of the digital revolution, obviously, but not only. We do research as well. That is to say, I mean, prospect can be an activity that you can do as a think tank or not as a player, but I mean, supporting research and innovation. Obviously, we have to intervene, financially speaking, with labs and companies to develop solutions. And once again, there's a huge potential with the digital for all projects almost, and the issue of data as well. And we have a certain number of databases which up to now were not open, as we said. And so this is a stake as well to see how can we use it, and this is one of the issues we might mention later on as well. Thank you very much. Jack, well, I'm going to ask questions in English for English speakers and French to French speakers.
So based on your experience and your research, maybe you can tell us first just give us an overview of the environmental impact of the digital systems as an introduction to what we were mentioning. And then maybe also to see how we can use these digital systems to affect maybe more sustainable production and consumption systems at global level.
Absolutely. That's what I've been thinking about now for quite a while. So hopefully I've... Well, so I think to frame this discussion, the leading academic model theory of this space of the interaction between as ICT, information and communication technology, as it's called, digital, and sustainability and environment on the other. The leading model has 3 levels, so hopefully that'll help frame things. It's by a professor in Switzerland called Lorenz Hilty. And the base level, the first level, is the direct impacts of these technologies. So, do they the use, the production of them, the use of them, the energy and the resources that are used, and then also the waste that's produced at the end. So this is very much where Fairphone has been working very effectively at innovating new models. And last night, so I was walking around meeting some of the startups here at the event last night, and there was one, Numanity, which is a French startup, which is really looking at how we do the sorts of digital things that we do, like sort of social networking and email, but how we do them in a more sustainable way. So that's the first level. Then the second level, which is really where I've been focused, is how you take these digital tools and apply them out there in the world to try and make the world a more sustainable place. The applications. That's very much been my focus. But that's not the end of it, because then really you have to think about, at the final level, what the overall structural impact on the economy, on society is, and how that has actually turned out. So there's two aspects of that. The big piece, the core of it, the one we think about most, is the resources and how we use resources more. That's formerly called decoupling. How we do more with less resources at a global level. But there's also a whole other aspect, which is what you might call institutional change. So how do we change laws? How do we change social norms, culture, in order to behave in a more for society work more sustainably?
And very precisely in terms of studying the apps, 'cause the second level you were mentioning, what trends do you see? So do you see an increasing trend of people or organizations, startups trying to use digital tools to affect sustainability, or is that very marginal in all the developments around the digital systems?
I see it's part of it. It's a big part of it. I often measure it by when I'm sitting on the tube in London and I look at the adverts. I am seeing quite a few adverts coming up for the sorts of companies that I'm interested in. So smart energy companies, smart home companies, smart mobility companies that have a sustainability angle. And I'm seeing quite a lot of those adverts coming through. So I think as a proportion of the digital industry, and also one with it's strongly consumer facing, a lot of it, it is a significant proportion, yeah. So based on my research and having looked and mapped out the sector, I see really three things that at this application, the second application level, three ways that you can apply these technologies in a positive way, and all these startups and things are doing at least one of them. So, and it all comes down to a process of optimization, digital optimization. So what that means is you've got some resources out there, and you gather digital data about them, and then you use the power of your artificial intelligence to work out how you can then control that use of resources much more efficiently. So that's what it comes down to, optimization. And basically with optimization, you can use information to displace resource use. So yeah, there are three, but that optimization, you can use it in three ways. So the first one is resource efficiency, circularity, and clean tech. So the first one is using resources much more efficiently. I mean, this is obviously the core of it. If you have the existing linear economy, as we think about it, where you've got these various processes of production and consumption that take resources out of the planet and turn them into products, and then we use them in our lives, each of those processes can be optimized digitally to use many less resources. Then the second one is circularity. If you take this linear economy that we have, we can put in a few more processes and turn it round so that it goes round again, so that instead of just destroying value at the end, we're sort of recreating value. And Fairphone have been doing a lot of interesting work there. So the sort of processes I'm thinking about are obviously recycling, reusing. The sharing economy is a massive one for digital. So how do we use stuff much more efficiently by sharing its use? And then finally, maintenance, just the boring practicality of keeping something going is a huge area. And then finally, actually, perhaps the most exciting bit is, rather than this old economy, which we want to be more efficient, we want to create, in some sense, a new economy. We want to bring in, we want to sell more things. Surprisingly, for sustainability, does involve actually selling more stuff sometimes, and those things are, for instance, you might call them clean tech. So solar panels is a archetypal example. We need to get much more photovoltaics out there. And again, there are lots of processes of production and consumption that in the life cycle that can be optimized with digital technologies to make push out much more of this clean tech as fast as possible.
I remember a few years ago, the ICT industry had published a report with UNEP, I think with the UN, called Smart 2020, saying, okay, the positive effect of digital systems is going to be more important than the negative effect, meaning mostly the impact on climate change, but also the impact on natural resources, etc. Would you say it is so? Like the positive impact, is it greater than the negative impact of ICT yet?
Can I hold off on that question and answer that at the end?
When? In a few years? You mean, or in a few decades?
All right. Well, I'll tell you. Okay.
No, just
sure.
Because that's key in.
Sure. Okay. I think that's far too complex a question when you really think about the very different ways in which the digital revolution works out into it, to possibly be able to quantify it. Now, the Smarter 2020 report, dare I say, is an industry report by the ICT industry, so it's not entirely surprising. That's not to say there wasn't a lot of good research in there and a lot of good ideas. I used it in my research and things, but I couldn't possibly comment on that. I can say there's lots of good news and there's lots of bad news. So the bad news that I would talk about is basically innovation is we have sustainability problems because we have innovation. Well, we have environmental problems because we have innovation. We're dealing with the impacts of the industrial revolution, and so this process of acceleration, digital is just accelerating further, and it's doing it at an exponential rate. And so, that causes more sustainable problems. There are human impacts. You've talked about privacy impacts, security impacts, inequality problems in our society, and that's true for smart green systems just as it is for everything else. And then in the longer term, looking out into the future, in the next 20 or 30 years, we've got the coming of what people are calling superintelligence, that the artificial intelligence is getting faster at such a rate that we have to think about what the world is going to be like with machines that are far cleverer than we are. And I certainly don't have the answers to what that's going to be like. I don't think anyone does, but it poses risks, environmental risks, just as much as it poses social risks. There are lots of good news. There's lots of good news as well, though. I have a framework that I've developed from my PhD that helps you understand the range of ways in which you can apply these amazing digital innovations across the board in sustainability to really make a difference in whatever supply chain and whatever consumption process for sustainability. This superintelligence that is emerging in the future, it's possible that's going to empower us to deal with some really what are called wicked problems in sustainability. So real complex problems that we're having trouble. I meat climate change itself. I've been in conversation with Google DeepMind that have a new, who are artificial intelligence, at the forefront of artificial intelligence, and they have a new team that's has a stated aim to address climate change or solve climate change. I don't think we're going to solve climate change anytime soon, but then maybe with superintelligence we're going to have some amazing tools to do it. And then I guess the final thing is just this disruption process, because you talked a lot about this. In fact, I think it's transition. Digital is producing this massive disruption across the industry. We're having all these old ways of doing things, these old, what are called socio-technical regimes are being smashed apart. And I think our job, in a way, is to smuggle in sustainability, a process of smuggling in sustainable ways of doing things in with the new digital ways of doing things that are emerging.
Okay, thank you very much. François, on va passer à vous
Let's move on to you and the net positive result of the digital transition means you minimize impacts in terms of the environment in particular, negative impact of the digital systems, and try and qualify this impact, which is not an easy task because I mean you can read loads of things and it's great, so it looks great to read on tablets because there's less paper, you kill less trees, but in fact when you look at the energy consumption, it's not that obvious. In fact, books remain a good option compared to tablets. So my first question was, where are we exactly in terms of research on the impact of the environmental impact of the technology? And it's not only the environment, you mentioned data as well, there's other issues, so you see the positive impact, citizen participations and so on, and the ethical and democratical questions. So limit the negative impact, and I mean, where are we? And then potentially same thing for positive impacts and the icing on the cake, which is how can you use as well a new digital transition to use it for energy transition. I know that the DEM issued a report on this. I mean, how do you combine both? Yes, indeed, I think that first of all, you shouldn't ask the question this way to see if digital technologies in our consumption modes, I mean, is it a good thing or a bad thing? Because they're here anyways. It's too late. It's much more, how can you make sure that these technologies have as little impact as possible on the environment and make the most of what's positive in digital? But I would say, I mean, you couldn't do the ecological and energy transition without these tools anyway. Given the objectives that we have, for example, for the penetration of variable renewable energies, you see that you need smart networks, smart grids, and to have the smart grids, you need these digital technologies and having decentralized production. Maybe you can explain, I mean, obviously wind farms and sun energy, so they don't produce all the time, they are predictable, partly predictable. But what's for sure is that, I mean, you don't have solar energy at midnight, so you should be able to quantify that. And in fact, you see that the decentralized production of these energies, because it's, I mean, one of the ways, the major ways for this energy transition. I mean, the self-consumption, for example, is based now to be developed collectively on digital tools such as what we call blockchains that can track where the energy comes from and where it could be produced in one place and used in another place. For example, we supported a project from a company that works with energies to make sure that renewable energy producers in their house at home can use this energy on their working place to charge their electric car, for example. How can you make sure that you can track the fact that this consumption is self-consumption because they produced it at home without it being identified as such? So you see that there's essential items in the energy transition, and you see that the mobility issue as well, shared mobility that we're starting to see now. I mean, I'm struck to see that 10 years ago, I remember when we did prospects, we said, I mean, the most difficult sector where we won't manage consumption, I remember some experts said it will be transport because it's growing, and consumption is growing. And you see now that it's not at all like it was before. I mean, the magical cost of carbon reduction in transport is not at all what we thought it would be 10 years ago. So it's absolutely crucial that we have these digital technologies to do the transition. And all the same, as you said, there's impacts. And they can be negative. I mean, there's studies, for example, we assess the impact of working at home for greenhouse gas effects, and the results that we found with a very ambitious notion was a gain of 0.5%, in fact, on greenhouse gas emissions. So 0.5% means it's very questionable and you need more work. And what we noticed today is that there's a great lack in assessment of environmental impacts of technologies. We don't know exactly. I mean, this debate. I mean, it's based on scenarios for use which are not obvious to imagine. Yes, absolutely. And I mean, you have this uncertainty. So it's difficult to assess exactly how much electricity you use. Yes, because on these issues, I mean, this is the striking aspect we mentioned before with the Smart 2020 reports done by the industry. You feel that on the one hand, you have the industry players that say, well, we have a fantastic landscape and digital is going to solve everything with digital issues. And on the other hand, you have players who are maybe more on the civil society and NGO side, on the environmental impacts and ethical impact as well, with this idea that, I mean, we don't want to stop it, it's not the issue, but to say, be careful, we'll have, even on for some players in the new economy, such as Airbnb or Uber, for example, you see there's both a use of technologies with an improvement in quality of services and positive impacts. Uber is the first employer in suburbs that you couldn't see before, so it has to say something about that. And at the same time, ethical questions and social and societal issues as well.
So from a strictly environmental point of view, we did research on this. I'm not an expert, but we're talking about object internet and object connected. And in 2016, last year, there were 15 billion objects that were connected in the world. So now the connection of these objects to the network as such is done via Wi-Fi that consumes about 2 watts per object continuously. That accounts for the figure that I mentioned. Only for the object connections that I meant, 160 terawatt hour. It's about half of the consumption of France's, basically in terms of energy. And the use of this can actually be debatable. Yes, you're right, yes. But this all accounts, this can also help you to better run your electricity bill in your home. There'll be 50 or 90 billion objects that will be connected in 3 years. So if we now extrapolate, and these objects connect about 10 times a day to the network, to the grid. So we think there'll be 1,000 connections of these objects per day. So they would be electricity consumption that would absolutely mad. So we can do the protocols for communication for these objects via the grid, which are less of the microwatt. So what we can say in 2020, by 2020, most of the connected object could only consume 40 kilowatt per hour per year. You can see the sort of the magnitude of what we could gain if we worked on reducing such impacts. These impacts are high, but we can see we can actually control them. Third aspect I wanted to mention, the use of these digital technologies to give consumers the ability, there's an English word that I never translate, what we call empowerment. You give people the possibility to actually control, check what they do in zero energy consuming buildings. For example, you can see that there, consumers, on the basis of their behavior, it will have positive energy or not or consume. So that's where the role of communication is important, because it can give them the possibility, give people the possibility of avoiding peaks of consumption, because they spend less on their heating bills, that they'll spend more money elsewhere. These technologies will help them educate their behaviors on the basis of algorithms. Now we have timers, which are very clever and know sort of learn how people behave with artificial intelligence, and it gives people the possibility of reducing their consumption. So in the various facets of the digital revolution, are there aspects, I don't know, that seem to you to be important? Big data, artificial intelligence. Are there levers that seem to you to be more important for the energy transition, or will they all be important but to a lesser extent or more extent, greater extent? So the digital revolution, of course, covers the artificial intelligence. We'll have to specify what we mean by that. But we see in all the projects that we actually made, we have a green pack. We did a green pack tender last year to see what sort of proposals businesses had. And these innovations, which are at the service of the energy and ecological transition, we sustain quite major projects. For example, we had a big project on data centers. That's a very important treating the processing of data is absolutely essential. We can reduce it by 30 or 40%, the consumption of electricity of a data center, particularly by resorting to natural convection. So there are areas, we see that in quite a number of projects that we are sponsoring. It can only be done through the digital revolution. That's true. When I was listening to you, we were talking about cultural revolution. Shouldn't we also educate the sort of stakeholders? We said at the Grenelle time when we spoke about green projects in France and green society, we should maybe have an idea of the impact of training. For example, train farmers on the what traditional growing methods do, or more organic systems do. Try to train architects to start again by explaining the environmental impact of buildings. Are we sure that developers, people who are trained together to tomorrow's digital stakeholders, do they know how to use these data and these servers, and how can we use data centers for to sort of sponsor the transition? It's clear that digital training is part of all form of education. It's true that it starts from schools. It's a certain opening one's mind. It is essential to be acquainted with the digital aspect. You can see that age differences are clearly important. Of course, we do not take into account enough the digital training, particularly in general training, particularly for building consumption. We have to do sort of modeling of the building stock, for example, that lots of work could still be done. So my question is there enough training on the impact on the environment of people that we train in the digital field? That too, of course. The question is also reversed. All the digital sort of professionals we're training now, are we sure that they come to the labor market and start developing in businesses by being aware of these issues? We can see that these people who take part in this revolution, the digital revolution, they're obviously turned towards the future, and they are in a position to understand what is at stake with the transition. There's just one thing I wanted to mention recently about the importance of the digital issues. It's in less developed countries on the access to energy. In Africa, for example, up till now, the electrification that was decentralized seemed to be the only way, or an intermediate way, before actually having a proper grid. But with the drop in photovoltaic renewables and development of renewables as such, but with the mobile network, we also have solution which is called pay-as-you-go, which enable households to actually have access to decentralized electricity that's much cheaper than having connection to the grid. The ability of having economic development thanks to mobile phones, which enables you to factor in the investment that is done and amortize it over time and get it back over time, and avoids people fleeing the countryside and going to the cities. I think it can only be done through the digital revolution, really, or digital tools. Edouard, GRDF, as you said, has put ecological transition at the core of its business mission, of course, because you're an actor and you're a major stakeholder in that field. But also there's the territorial aspect, the role which territories will play on this issue of ecological transition, and the way GRDF is actually using this instrumentally to help the transition. Yes, you rightly said that the ultimate objective is to have a decarbonated world. We can see the path. It's one of the major brick in that building. It's digital. The digital transition would be unthinkable. Of course, if we didn't have that tool, I mean, it was the environmental transition would be unthinkable without the digital one. So we have to have positive transition. So it's important for us to sort of go along with it and remind each stakeholder how important some elements in those chains, some links in that chains are. We can see with COP21 that a state can say, no, the state is not an objective which is of interest to me. There are many territories within the state. Well, we can say what the head of state says, but we'll carry on as things are. You're thinking about somebody in particular, in a country in particular? Yes, I am. So we can see there's a certain solidarity. Technologies can enable to do everything. If you're very rich, you can say, okay, I want my new building to have positive energy. I'll put solar panels. There are also windows can actually capture electricity. It's not because you can make that link that it'll be the most efficient link. That's not necessarily the link that will enable you to get people together and behind a similar project. When there's a very strong communal community spirit, when there's a historical distribution of energy that is decentralized, sometimes we can see all these links are converging. And when we're trying to be there, we want to make sure that the projects are shared. Each level of the local authorities can actually cooperate to make sure that the solar panels, it's only the rich who can afford to put them on, and to have basically a system of purchasing this back, which means that they make the poor pay for it. So as an element in the public, since we we are part of the public service, we now have an internet site which is called Ma Concession Gaz, which enables all the stakeholders to have access to all the data through that. And that's why it's important to have communicating meters as a result of those meters that are being installed throughout France. 500,000 of those meters digital meters have been installed throughout France. So our ambition is that we want to measure, to quantify. It'll be important for local authorities to know who consumes what, to have least consuming energy and energy market, and basically help consumers to have benchmarks. It'll help consumers, private citizens, but also local authorities. And we're trying to make this data available to everyone. And we have to communicate them, these data. The idea is, of course, to keep private data safe, confidential, so we can decide which data can actually be made available and to whom. I'd like to insist on renewable gas. I insisted on this. We have what we call agricultural methanization. It's a way of have rural areas which have major potential. We can have a more sustainable agriculture. You can see that when you do that type of methanization, and it helps with nitrates, and it also connects everybody better. And that's why it's important to have really established network. In Africa, we can have different networks. Here in France, we have such network, and some of it is part of the local authorities. We have to basically connect urban and cities and the lands and the countryside. So Michael Schumann spoke yesterday about pollinating businesses. How can you basically do that at the level of transition? I suppose it depends on what local authorities want. You mentioned the States. We can say as a reaction to Trump's position, cities, states have actually made it clear, well, we're going to go even farther where we were planning as a way to overreact to what Trump said about climate change. So can you give us in France an example of a territory or things are going particularly well because the local authorities are really behind the project, but because we have an ecosystem which GRDF, with whom GRDF works well? How does it work then when it works well? There are examples everywhere. Each territory has to find the best solution. The resources differ from one area to the other. Challenges are different as well. GRDF, there's the biomethane is very strong. We'll have a specific center in this area. We'll develop skills. 3 ministers who went to the valley of Arc. We can see that the idea is to replace the boilers, and that is an element that is important, and that means that each territory has to find its own answer, and our strength is to crisscross the whole area. We try to have biomethane, encourage farmers to get together to find the best solution for their own territory. The main success we can have is that project that started off from one farm, then spreads on to the green waste of the next door municipality, or maybe the waste of agribusiness concern. So every time you try to make connections and make sure that you connect up to the environment to see how a more integrated project will create not only more value energy-wise, but will also be more accepted, taken in the territory. So we were talking about cultural revolution earlier on. It's not only the digital revolution. People are doing things that they didn't used to do before and which they didn't think was part of their job. For example, go and see the farmers, for example, see how they can use the methane they produce, create networks between the various stakeholders. How is that? How are jobs changing then? Is it enough to just recruit people, as François said, who've always been working in the digital sector or the energy transition? But with biomethane, we have an agronomist, and I realized that in the past we'd already recruited such people, but not to do to work with agronomy, but they were doing other things. Of course, on the digitally. We recruited lots of people. No business really. It's clear that we have to have digital tools to make progress. François Moisan mentioned it. It's all been true with gas. Gas system was quite simple before. There were big pipes, just like motorways. You'd put lots of pressure. You decompressed, and then you got up to the end consumer. Now, what you put at the end of the network, you also have a vision in real time of what the pressure is, which can come from everywhere. So it means that we have to streamline our operations. I can tell you that it's a challenge that is really very stimulating for all the teams, because, well, it's before people would only be centered on why put gas instead of other form of fuels, and now they have an extra sort of opportunities. And we've been working with major partners, with ADEME, with the INRA, which is the French National Institute in the field of agriculture. So the idea is to try and get all the knowledge together, to use it to the full. So I suppose there's an element that you mentioned, which is a source of pride, is that you don't just work about what you do on an everyday basis, on what you do, on how you do, but why do you do it, and what's the ultimate purpose is. And this means that it sort of stimulates you as a GRD, as the mission that you might have. Yes, we have an internal survey with our staff and our people who adhere to the GDRF mission, which are much higher than most, really. So it's this vision which, of course, gives the energy transition its full sort of meaning.
Récupérer le micro pour le passer à Michael, merci. So maybe as a final word of conclusion, it would be, I think, interesting to have your perspective on what the other speakers have said about the convergence between potential convergence between, or the level of convergence between the digital transition and the sustainability transition, and also again maybe a focus on your the key priorities that you have mentioned in your initial presentation.
Sure, I think I'll pick some of the arguments that were posed here. I think it is important to do everything that we've talked about, but as somebody was saying in the previous version, in the previous meeting, in an integrated way. And this is where social enterprises also put a lot of effort on. You cannot claim that you do a lot for the environment while your company is one of the highest avoiders of taxes, for instance. Or you cannot just sell electric cars without telling them that electric cars are more resource intensive at production, and they only pay off if you after the year. So we really need to look at life cycle. I mean, this is on and on. We always keep on saying this, but I keep on missing this from companies. That companies also use this kind of integrated life cycle approach when they sell also their products. So I don't know, another example, for example, is energy at home and all the energy that we use for warming our houses. There are mortgages that are on that you get a better interest if your energy level of your house is higher, right? And that also pushes you to fight the root cause, which is bad isolation in your house. The problem I see is that, one, environment has no borders, but two, companies do have borders in terms of the scope that they have in their business, and how fast and flexible can they change their business model to also be part of this transition. I don't know, I have more examples. I don't think we can talk about data and how we use or store data in a more efficient way while we design websites that hook users for hours and hours slurping their data at the same time. So I'm not trying to criticize. I'm just saying, like, let's also bring this discussion at a higher level and look at the business model, you know, like what companies need to do to, in an integrated way, have really a model that can help in this transition. You also talked, Francois, about empowering people, and we also talk very often about design for behavioral change, as if, you know, the consumer is an important part, but is not the only stakeholder here. I think we need to not necessarily design for behavioral change, but redesign our business models in a way that are so attractive that people don't even think that are being nudged into a different behavior or nudged into a new reality. It just feels normal. To me, it doesn't feel normal now that I go out of my house and there's a lot of space on the street used by cars that are stopped the whole day, when that could be just a garden in front of my house. So we can talk about all these topics separately, but I think, again, you know, like there's this necessity of going one step higher, and maybe that's through regulation. I don't have the answers, but I'm just saying that we as consumers can also be very critical with what companies offer us. Yeah, I think that was it.
Maybe we can go into details on what Fairphone has been trying to achieve on the four subjects that you were mentioning.
Yeah, I think
you mentioned the idea that, and I think if we take examples like in the textile industry, what Patagonia has been doing for more than 20 years, the fact that you have maybe a smaller player that tries to push the limits, the boundaries of what can be achieved.
Yeah, this is also,
it's worth going into details.
Yeah, and that's also related to your question before of, you know, are we going to, is it better like all the environmental benefits that these technologies bring, or what they cause also in terms of resources used? I say that they're both parallel, right? Like at the same time, there are more and more solutions to make that use of resources in a better way to serve those models. At Fairphone, the beauty of Fairphone is that, and that was on purpose, if we focus on one product, so it's one reality, one use case, but we use that one product to show a lot of alternatives that other people can use. I'll give you an example, for example. Because we are a small company, we still have a very traditional business model. So this is autocriticism. We sell smartphones, that's it. But it's very inefficient from a resource perspective, because smartphones are small, and when you stop using them and you want to buy a new one, you just drop it in your drawer, because, you know, they are so small. What am I going to do with that? I can keep it at home. So they are very difficult to take back. What if we change our business model, and that's one of the things that we are very busy with this year, into keeping the ownership of that device? Not your data or as a consumer, or not simply the physical device. So at the end of the use of that device, you know, like there is an incentive, well, basically because it's not yours as a consumer, but we could also do it through an incentivized take back, that we can take that back and really look at it and think like, okay, this part we can reuse, that part we cannot reuse, we need to recycle. And there is a lot of innovation that needs to come for that to make it happen. You know, like there's a lot of innovation that needs to happen in electronics to make sure that we can do diagnosis of the state of health. I'll give you an example. If we recover a mobile phone, I don't know how good the battery is. I don't know if it has been used for 1 year, if it has been used for 2 years, how many cycles it has gone. Maybe that battery has only been used for half a year. That means effectively that it has still 1.5 years of, you know, good use. So implementing a system in the battery, and this is possible, and the electronics of the battery, this is already used in laptops, for instance, but it's not yet in smartphones, that we can, when we get that battery, with a very simple action, see what is the state of health of that battery that can help us put that battery in service, maybe not as a new battery, but as a refurbished battery at a lower price, but really to make this use a more intense use of resources instead of just discarding them when they are end of use. So this is a lot of the work that is happening now.
Yeah, maybe you can mention also the work that you do on materials, raw materials.
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of investigation there. So I would say there's two parts. One is more on materials that have high social, let's say, issues behind. You know, this is really raw metals that are mined in countries like Congo, Rwanda, etc. So we do projects to make sure that we can work with mines that are out of the conflict, for instance, and we work actively to develop these mines into the next level, which would be something like similar to fair trade in coffee. This exists already for some metals, for gold, for instance, that we get from Peru, but that doesn't exist yet in many African countries. So that's one of the things that we do. So we trace the materials, we make sure that we understand how much of that material ends up in our product, because we are talking about international, very complex supply chains. So this is a humongous amount of work to connect with all these parties in your supply chain until you actually get all the way to the mine. Sometimes it comes the other way around as well. So that's part of the work we do. The other part is also working with suppliers to integrate more recycled materials, because we can talk about circular economy and putting a lot of these materials back in the system, but effectively there's a lot of suppliers, at least in our industry, that don't use so much recycled materials for many reasons. Technical, maybe they have never done it, maybe they've never thought about it even. So that's kind of the duality on the materials.
Okay. What about planned obsolescence? Because you're obviously on the market where...
It's a very difficult one on
it's
smartphones.
It's a tough one.
Yeah. I always say that I don't believe in the old way of thinking of planned obsolescence. I actually think that we need to plan obsolescence. We cannot ignore the fact that the technology that we are putting in the hands of consumers does have an expiry date, and does have an expiry date because of a lot of technical and economical reasons. So we need to plan it. But we need to plan it better. We need to plan it not to be short. We need to plan it to be very long, and to make sure that we can maintain those devices as long as possible. So some of the work that we do at Fairphone, and mind, we are a 4-year-old company, so we're quite new. So there's a lot of work to be done still. But for instance, software updates, good monthly software updates that secure your device against hacks, for instance. So that's one of the things that where consumers build trust in the product, and they think, hey, I can keep my device working longer. Can we do something about, I don't know, that Android, certain version of Android will not support certain version of WhatsApp at some point? No, that's something that we cannot change still, unfortunately. But we can make sure that that device, that hardware, that combination of hardware and software can keep working until that happens, until you cannot use, I don't know, Angry Birds in your device, which seems to be very important for a lot of people. No, but this is important, right? Like what consumers think and want and need. That's also part of the obsolescence problem, and we are very honest about it. So we try to also do both the work, so the internal work, but also the external work, to convince people that it does make a difference if you can change your screen in 10 seconds, because maybe that will make you actually change it and not buy a new device, or not wait until your operator gives you a new device. So it's this dual work, and that's also what I mean with integrated. I don't think we do everything perfect yet, but I think we are in that path to really have this life cycle approach, integrated approach, both consumer and what we do internally, and what we do with our partners in the supply chain.
Okay, thank you very much. On a le temps pour des questions.
We have time for questions, comments, if you have some, and if participants from the round table have reactions to what was said by others as well, please feel free. Jack, I don't know if you want to react. It gives you time to prepare your questions from the mic is going to come to you straight away. Jack, you want me to, maybe a reaction to what was said?
I was thinking a couple of things with what Miguel was touching on. So one, you talked about the sort of B Corp approach of being a responsible and sustainable business. And actually, coming out of my research, I've sort of put together a framework for understanding these smart green startups to help better measure their sustainability impact. And I don't think really there's much there at the moment to be able to understand how digital applications promote sustainability. So I think that's a space that really needs to be addressed, and I'm hoping we can do more in that space. The second, I mean, there are a few other things coming out of, related to that, coming out of my research framework for understanding this space, such as helping people generate more ideas and manage programs of investment. In fact, there's a venture capital firm in London that uses it to understand and explain the sustainability impact of the smart green startups that it invests in. And another thing was about integration. And you know, if integration is a problem, that's great, because digital, we've got that covered. Integrating stuff is what digital is really good at. It's optimization, really. It's kind of optimization at a social level. Yeah, you're talking about some of your ideas with sort of what you might call product service systems, where you start renting things instead of owning things. I think that is a really good model. It's better than the ownership model that we have from the past. And what you see with companies like Fairphone, there's also a company called Restart Project in London that does similar work, trying to help people fix their mobile phones at this, what I call the first level, the direct impacts of ICT, is actually then you have to move up onto the second level, and you have to think about how you're using IT to optimize your processes and allow you to do these things. You need applications of ICT and gathering lots of data in order to be able to, say, put a product service system in place in order to optimize your relationship with the customer and move away from these old models.
Okay, thank you very much. Alors, on va passer la parole.
We'll give the floor to. I don't know where the mic is. It's supposed to. Oh, you have. It's coming to you. Thank you very much. Well, please introduce yourself, ask your question, and tell us who it is for in particular. I'm Elizabeth. I'm the co-founder of the Squeeze brand. We're in circular economy and we are B Corp certified. We've been for the past 2 years.
C'est plus long, bon, c'est bon pour moi, merci.
Ok, parce que je vois qu'il y a beaucoup de monde.
I can see there's a lot of people with no headsets, maybe they're English speakers. Well, the question I had was, for whoever wants to answer it, it was regarding the situation you see today that can be a bit, how can I put it, weird in terms of new digital transition and the societal impact. I'm thinking of the situation in Venezuela today, where you have a population who's the latest figure in terms of access to internet, 60%, but the average weight loss was 9 kilos because they have nothing to eat. But everybody has got access to internet. All the same people have no food. So what kind of weird situation is that? So are there prospects, humanitarian prospects? Because I mean, you have this crazy situation where people have access to internet but don't have food. So I mean, you see it in Turkey, China, and so on. But these people, can we bring them solutions as well to their food problem? And thanks to technologies, I mean, can someone comment on this maybe? François.
Merci.
Yeah, the question you're asking makes me think of what I said before regarding access to energy in developing countries. It's not the same situation as Venezuela, which was a richer country, rather rich anyway, and rather developed. I lived there for 2 years, in fact, when I was young. And it's horrible what's happening now. This country is disintegrating, basically. But the fact that people have access to the internet and no food, I mean, this trend is rather kind of the opposite of growth and well-being. However, when I mentioned developing countries before and the fact that smartphones make it possible to implement solutions, decentralized solutions for electricity production and access to energy apart from grids, because they're not in these countries. I mean, it's too decentralized to have networks the way we know them in our countries. So these solutions bring the ability to have productive activities for these people, and so they develop and take part in development. I was very struck to hear that what creates, I mean, I mentioned it briefly, but what creates the exodus towards cities, in fact, the main factor is access or not to mobile phone networks. It's not electricity because now we have decentralized solution to have development, even though this decentralized network does not exist. So indeed, these people who are amongst the poorest might not have access to the right level of life. They can develop, and this solution, and here it makes it possible for investment on these production technologies which are renewable and decentralized can be amortized, in fact, by a billing system whereby it's through mobile phones that each time these people use electricity, it's billed at a certain level which is in line with their resources, and they won't have to buy oil and very expensive resources anymore. So this is a virtuous system which makes it possible for them to improve their life situation. So this is a system where the digital technologies make it possible to fight malnutrition. So there might be something with what you said regarding GRDF, the role of territories, and how you can make sure that technologies can be mobilized for things which are low-tech on territories, such as, for example, the ruche qui dit in France between local food production and local needs as well, and food waste, fighting food waste, and having various apps and connecting what would be thrown away by supermarkets, for example, or restaurants, and the needs, local needs. Elizabeth, when you say low-tech, I think in digital you have low-tech as well, and this is very, very important. You shouldn't think that it's only high-tech. Somebody else wants to react? Yeah, I'll try in French, in fact. And wish me luck.
Je suis pas une cyber-utopien.
This is a bit of a utopia, isn't it?
Utopia.
It's
on arrive. Vous êtes en utopie. On arrive à une utopie digitale.
You can have this kind of digital utopia. Everything's changing. A lot of things change it, but there's a strong item, a digital dimension in many changes that you can see today. So far, such as the Arab Spring, but the Arab Spring ended with what happened in Libya, Egypt, and Syria. And last year, in 2016, we had Brexit and Trump. So there is a digital dimension in all these phenomena. And it is not, how can I put it? It's not something which is kind of evil, but it's an increasing fast process, an increasing process. And for me, I'm focused on my framework and see how we can use tools. These tools to try and reach can meet goals. Specific objectives. So it's very powerful. And to reach your personal objective, you have the costs as well, the forecast, and well, there's a lot of things anyway that you have to take into account in terms of ecological impact of smartphones at the first level. But at the end of the day, if you think of the future with the super intelligence dimension, which is coming up in about 20 or 30 years, who knows if we'll survive this experience, we'll have the power to maybe think of these problems, wicked problems, like I call them, in politics, such as climate change, which is a huge political issue, such as a technical problem, as well as a technical problem. So what's important is not to have this utopia, but be realistic and see how we can use this change in a positive way.
Yeah, just a final word. I totally share your thoughts, and that's exactly what I meant with integration. So I didn't mean integrating more knowledge that we have, but also integrating between the scopes of different organizations and different companies and different levels, also government and companies. I think this wicked system we live in allows for these situations to happen, which is very sad, and it goes much more to an economic level and free market, for instance, than yeah. So I just make a pledge to turn it upside down, as your question also brought, like what are the actual needs of a certain community, and then how can we serve those the best way, and then see if digital technologies can help in serving those needs. But you have these examples, unfortunately, in so many places. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Il y avait une question derrière, monsieur.
There's a question right behind. Good morning, I'm Raphael. I'm a part of Circular, a network of startups. I had two questions. First of all, thank you for your presentation. The first question was to say, well, digital transition will have to face two major challenges. The first one is, all these new technologies use what we call rare material, rare earth. We know that there's several millions, smartphones, there's several thousands of smartphones on the market every day using these rare materials. So how do you face, such as in a model where you have, you don't have undefined quantities of resources. If you stick to your linear approach, it won't work. And we didn't talk about the digital transition in developing countries, but there will be major challenges, and I'd like to have your opinion on this, and especially on the fact that these hundreds and thousands of new technologies in northern countries in particular will be in southern countries later on. So there's in Ghana, for example, and there's a great issue for collecting electronic waste, for example, digital waste. What are the solutions today to face this issue for today and for tomorrow? Okay, for resources, this has to do with circular economy as well. Going back to what you said yourself, who wants to answer that? Mikel?
Yeah, I can start. I think it goes back to one of the things that we were saying, no? That the benefits that we will get from these digital technologies on one side, and the use of resources that causes. And I think there will be developments in both ways. We will also find at the same time, maybe I'm too positive, but I think we will also find ways of serving the same digital needs with less material or less hardware, let's say. So I think that will go at the same time. What happens also, and again, this wicked system we live in, that changes happen really fast sometimes. They happen faster than what society can actually deal with. So now we have electronic vehicles, which are great, but use a lot of cobalt, for instance, in the batteries. We see that a lot of, not to blame Tesla, which I think is a great company, but you can rate also that a lot of Tesla owners actually have a Tesla as a second car, which is, it's great. They're at the forefront of the transition, and they're making electric cars the normal, and that's great. But at the same time, we're putting a lot of cobalt in all these batteries, and that will have a huge effect on the market of cobalt in the short term, because now all of a sudden this transition to electric cars is going to happen really fast. So I share the worry. I don't know what the solution is, because I think it's, again, related to this wicked system we live in. And think these transitions happen sometimes a little bit too fast for society and too fast for, our Earth and the resources that is needed to make those transitions. I wish that we would think about all these problems before starting these transitions, right? That we would think like, oh, great, electric cars, but do we have the cobalt supply chain sorted out? No. Okay, let's start with that. And yeah, it's difficult to give an answer, but I see both problems.
Peut-être François sur ce sujet-là, il y a
François, on this issue, I mean, there's two sub-questions. In fact, there's one specific on the impact on the environment for technologies. That today, how can you? I mean, how does the DEM in its research, but also France, from a regulations point of view, tackle these issues, and also the issues well related to circular economy. I mean, the future, will you be able to produce? I mean, obsolescence as well, and circular economy. I mean, in the future, can we produce a mobile phone based on an old mobile phone? I mean, if Fairphone, for example, doesn't conquer 90% of the market, but what I had in mind was that there's European regulations which already aim at by 2020 at having the same cable, and we would like this to happen because now when you have a new phone, you need to buy a new cable as well. So there's a real issue there. And the second question is, on top of that, when we don't use this anymore, you know, instead of, well, we send it to certain countries where they pollute groundwater. And I mean, the questions are very relevant and very important. So it covers a lot of different things. There's ways of reacting, and what we said on recycling products, and this can be done with regulations indeed to a lengthened lifetime and recycle products as much as possible. And where are we on these regulations, and specifically on electronic aspects and smartphone, computers, and all this today? It doesn't feel, I mean, maybe because manufacturers are a great lobby, but there are regulations, obviously. It's very difficult, but there's an issue on resource protection, and what we mentioned about digital and mobile phones, we can find it as well for some transition solutions which are not directly digital. You mentioned batteries before, and for example, you try and so for batteries used in cars, we know that as soon as they lose 80% of their charging capacities, they can not be used in vehicles, and you can have other types of usage. So we try and have batteries with two lives, in a way, one in cars, and then to store electricity coming from solar panel, but you need to organize subsidiaries, and then you shouldn't be too optimistic saying you can solve everything with research, but it is true that with research on design and switching this rare earth, and I know that there were criticism on wind farm motors using magnets with rare earth, and we had technology development to avoid using these rare earths. So research can help. And for recycling, for example, it's not on rare earth, but on titanium. But I think it's another interesting example because it's a very costly material. We use it in aeronautics, for example, and the problem is that 80% of the raw material is lost when you manufacture the pieces, because it's, I mean, basically it's shaped and sewn, and up to now there was no plant in Europe recycling byproducts from titanium. And a few weeks ago we inaugurated a plant, and them intervened with a future investment program in capital. So it's the first plant in Europe where you can recycle byproducts from titanium. As I said before, 80% was lost before. So there are technological progress to do that. I don't want to be too optimistic for all rare earths, which are essential to the digital evolution. But this is one of the aspects as well. Maybe if you want to comment on this. So obviously it reminded me that in the world of energy there's a very famous sentence which is in the 60s, Shakimani, who was the minister, Saudi minister for energy, said, I mean, the Stone Age didn't stop because we lacked stone. And this, when he said it, nobody could imagine that we could run out of oil. So, I mean, we're not there yet, and we can't do without oil yet, but we're really trying to think that there's other solutions, and you can see that in the debate related to finance. I mean, a lot of people said all the oil resources which were already found might not be used completely. So the ability to find new solutions which save resources, once again, I don't know if I'm part of, I'm too optimistic, but it's always amazing to see the way new solutions and innovation can be found and can solve issues. And if you think of the growth, at some point it won't be possible anymore. So you have to look at all that. But it doesn't mean, and I guess the lesson to be learned on rare earth, you should never think that one solution will solve everything. So it's important not only to implement circular economy, that's for sure, but mainly to be careful and think of developing new technologies. And reminds me of what you said before regarding architects that can innovate as well, except that most architects say, yeah, but there's so many regulations in the way you build buildings that in some situations where there's a certain orientation where you could do things which are smarter, you can't because of regulations. So this balance between even innovation and regulation is very, very complex. So you know that there wouldn't be all the issues without regulations, but I mean, it's needed, but you have to make sure that it's not an obstacle to innovation. It's a permanent challenge on which all players have to work, and it has to be done with discussions. It's sometimes very complex with several industrial players, and you see that there's often obviously national stakes as well, but at the same time it's only with this balance that we can find sustainable solutions, including for territories that have a right to experiment. Yes, I mean, these territories have to face energy issues. Yes, for me it's obvious in terms of requirements for buildings that we have now. We cannot think in a country like France. And I mean, the stakes and solutions are not the same, obviously. In Lorraine, in the Côte d'Azur, I mean, one is very cold in winter and one is very hot in summer. So it means that the rules in terms of buildings have to be adapted to local specificities, and there's other debates on what level to give this right to regulate, because once again, if you have norms which are different in each city in France, you see that it's impossible to be able to take this into account. So what is the right level? How can you do it? How can you maintain efficiency for this activity? Obviously, I mean, you have the scale effect, but at the same time, you need to be able to adapt to local situations.
Parce qu'on voit bien,
It's not an easy topic. I was talking once about electric cars with businessmen, and some of them say, okay, well, it's not a good, maybe there'll be the impact of the battery, so maybe it's not a good idea to transition to that. But if you don't create the market, there'd be no motivation, no incentive to use the impact of batteries. So when you see Volvo, who's openly said in 2019 they would only work on electric cars and sort of force themselves to find solution to the issue of batteries. It's a gamble on basically on the future between innovation and should we be careful or should we have faith in our abilities to change? You have to actually assess where challenges are. There are recurrent challenges and some that are sort of ad hoc ones. There's no surprise if there are vehicles with fuel tanks. When you fill up at the petrol station, there's an amazing transfer of energy if you're thinking about a stock of recharging batteries. The station areas on motorways, if we had to recharge batteries in a way that is as efficient as fuel refills are, what would be the equivalent of the electric power required? If maybe the mathematical equation, the fact is that at oil stations, if we all filled up at the same time, it would be actually 4 times worth of the actual French electricity consumption. So the first time I spoke about that to an electrician, he said, well, no one is gonna, you never fill up together. Quite apart from when, at summer, when everybody is filling up before going on holidays, of course that happens too. Maybe it's a rare way, a scarce way of using all this energy, but maybe the day you go on holiday, when you charge at the same time, you'll need an alternative solution. That's why I said there is no single solution that will be able to fit all situations. And that means that local authorities, and ADEME is very important in that, you have to have multiple solutions. Even if some solutions are particularly good, others will be geared to specific situations. Maybe on the issue of waste, Jack, can you say a few things about transfer of weights into southern countries, the emerging countries? I'm not a specialist about waste, but what I can say, it's very easy to actually lose track about the future. You think it's slightly utopian, so maybe it's sustainable. You also have to think things out.
One has to measure we have to try and measure it. It's impossible to measure it perfectly. It's a complex problem, but one has to try to measure the impacts of these technologies in order to be able to say, are they any better? Perhaps it's better to stick with fossil fuels because actually moving to electric vehicles has too many implications in terms of rare materials and things. We have to think this through. So I have tried so there's the impacts on the first level which need to be measured, and there are life cycle assessment methodologies to measure that. There are then impacts on the second level in terms of the applications, and there aren't too many methodologies. So I've tried with my framework to come up with a basis for measuring those the impacts of those applications in order to be able to say with a bit more certainty, is this technology actually more environmentally friendly? And the other thing I would say was, so there's a little plea there from Miguel, I wish we could stop some of this stuff. Well, we can't really stop the thrust of innovation and how global development happens. It's amazing if you look just at IT, the way that it's got cleverer, the way that it's got faster. It's been so incredibly predictable for over 100 years, and that will continue. And that's a process that's bigger than everyone, unless there's some major crisis. So therefore, but what we can do, according to this sort of theory of transitions, socio-technical transitions, a guy called Frank Giels, is that when these so you have these old regimes, and then you have a disruption, and you have new regimes coming in, there's a window of opportunity there to maybe set better rules in the new regime that comes in. And I think that's the opportunity here, is for, if we can get the more ethical, the more responsible, the more sustainable digital startups and digital projects and digital approaches and regulations enshrined, then once they're in place, one way or another, we're stuck with them for quite a while, because once you get these things in place, they're there for the long term.
Maybe on the question of the issue of waste in southern countries.
Yeah, I just, very quick, I didn't make a plea for stopping innovation. I just made a plea for thinking a little bit better. And you, in your reaction, you already said, we've seen a lot of development that were already, we knew that they were going to come, but still we failed at understanding all the consequences of this development and the consequences that this development would have for natural resources. And to your question about Ghana, actually, I was in Ghana 3 weeks ago for a week there, visiting our projects there. And I just want to say again, sustainability has no borders, right? And sustainability and development sometimes goes a little bit too fast. So this is the same, the huge waste problem in Ghana and in many other countries. Ghana has been a lot in the media, but unfortunately happens in a lot of places. Is there also, because there is a lot of internal consumption of electronics in that country, because it's a country that is doing well and better, so people consume more and people want to have everything that that they want to have because they have the money now to have it. So in Ghana, it's very particular. You walk in Accra, and then you can go to the scrap fields, Goploshi, like very famous, and see all the electronic waste and a lot of different types of waste that is there. Well, it's not waste really, because they take a lot of materials out of it. So let's call it scrap field. And then you just walk around the corner, and then you see all this advertising of technology also for people to consume there. I don't want to stop that, but that's a reality, right? So that advancement has gone too fast in places like Ghana, because they still, in Ghana, we are not even talking about poor recycling or something like that. There's effectively very little, close to nothing recycling, like proper recycling, let's call it like this, of electronic waste in Ghana. So everything that ends up, doesn't matter if it's secondhand, doesn't matter if it's new because it's used in that market, will end up in places where it shouldn't end up, and it will be processed in ways that it shouldn't be processed for health. So I don't know if you were looking for an answer to like a solution on how to stop that. In that one, I'm very negative, I would say. Like there's not a lot of solutions unless there is a lot of investment in countries like that to do recycling, to bring recycling companies there. Because we have some of the solutions that can bring recyclability of ICT to 50% of the materials, but that's not even there yet. So like there's a huge gap on transferring these technologies as well, and to cope with the effects of this technological transition. It's all like around, yeah.
Thank you, François. Une petite réaction là-dessus.
Just now, on the issue of waste, particularly that are dangerous, and in developing countries, there are international conventions that ban the actual use, the import of recycled sort of waste. Of recycled phones, is not applied everywhere. Then very often they exported not as being waste, but as second-hand, really. So you have to know that what we call the rules which we have in our European countries on D3E, it's a whole. It means that there's a whole arsenal of infrastructure, that rules that exist, and if you don't go to countries, in emerging countries, states are wondering what sort of rules in order to set up, in order to face up to waste, electronic waste in particular, but not only, so that in developing, as Miguel said, there might be an exploitation, but that is not sort of regulated. It's just linked to the collection of those elements, if they have a sort of a value of exchange, a purchasing value. But it's a bit risky, really.
Yeah, but you now talk about the regulation for... sorry, I said this myself. The regulation for shipping e-waste or second-hand devices, but I was talking about new devices as well. And that's very often forgotten. The real problem of these countries, if I may say, is not necessarily the import of second-hand goods that may have a life cycle that is shorter than first life goods, but the internal consumption of these countries and how there is no infrastructure in place to cope with this internal consumption. So
it was what I was saying in the second part of my intervention, is that these countries doesn't have the framework we have in Europe about producer responsibility for the product.
They do, because this legislation you refer about, it's international. So
no, I was not speaking about exporting. I was speaking about in France, in Germany, we have a regulation that means that when a producer put on the market a new product, he has the responsibility of the end of life of the life cycle. And we call responsabilité élargie du producteur. And
I bet there is regulation as well in Ghana. The problem is that in Ghana there's much more pressing problems before solving this problem as well. Yeah, so that we come into the development.
Ghana doesn't have responsibility and large of the producer. if they don't have, because it's a very long way, and in France we were working for many years about to put this we call filière rep.
Which comes back also to the producer's responsibility, like to the companies, because it's the same companies which are international. Exactly. That's the point. Goes back to CSR. D'autres questions, commentaires?
There are other questions, comments?
Non, le micro est ailleurs. Alors profitez du fait que vous avez le micro.
So take a hello, thank you very much. I have a question on the reaction of the GRDF teams, particularly on their commitment. This economic transition isn't a way of actually searching for some meaning within businesses and at macro level. This digital transformation maybe has taught us to cope with changes in a different way. Couldn't we just build on this digital transformation to speed up the ecological transition as to paradigm change or shift and behaviors? As I said in my introduction, it's true that if we benchmark what we do, we have a pride, a feeling of pride, which has always been very sort of high, because we're at the core of the DNA of GRDF, which are very high, these criteria, because there's a time when people start challenging you on fossil fuels. We think that will be serving this transition. We'll try and ensure that people to consume less energy, make sure that gas is greener. So it's an extra boost that adds up to the historical tradition which we have in terms of safety, because, of course, our first objective is to ensure that all our operations are done by complying with safety laws. So we committed really very high. How does the digital revolution change this? Well, the revolution is underway. Our policy at GRDF aims at being very open through social networks by giving our employees the ability to react. They are present on Twitter, and we sort of encourage this. The Twitter people had come to get us, to see to us, and they said that and they were telling us they were interested in how we were so popular, because lots of businesses were a bit worried about tweeters, and if people start saying about what's happening internally to the rest of the world, then that's not really, isn't there a risk on our image? And we thought it would be different. We thought our employees would be responsible, and we encourage this attitude, this open-minded attitude. And I think it's also a way for us to be aware of what's happening. Lots of things are happening on the ground that we are made aware of, and there's very sort of a two-way communication. There's, for example, I liked, as I often do, when a tweet, and then later I saw it was a young lad who'd just been taken on. He said, "I've only been a few weeks in the business, and the big boss actually liked what I said, so he was very thrilled." So I think that I don't know whether we have to talk about a free business, or we think that by giving meaning, adding meaning to our business mission and letting people share their experience is a very strong motivator for our staff, and it's a way of being more efficient for our business and the community at large, because we are in the public service. And it's the same transition. There was another question. There'll be another two questions in the back, I think. Hello. I'd like to go back on what you said about the ownership to having free access, the fact of not being owning the object, but only be a temporary owner or having temporary rent of it. which is at the basis of society and which is linked to the digital transformation. And it's linked to the question about Venezuela. Maybe an element, maybe to answer to these questions, that there was a digital solution in Venezuela to the very high rise of inflation. Large number of people started using Bitcoin, which is based on blockchain, that Monsieur Moisan mentioned earlier on. So to which extent, how did you use this blockchain to go from this ownership society to society of access? Because the idea is to decentralize production. You mentioned it earlier on. And then, how are you thinking of integrating in your programs, your own programs, this blockchain? You speaking to François? You have to say it to him then. The question was directed at him. Blockchain. It's a very ambitious question, so I'd like to have the answer straight away. I mentioned it because it's something 4 years ago. I didn't know what blockchain was. And then, indeed, I'm almost an observer. I'm just almost this, I noticed it wasn't a question of creating bitcoins. And if we see what happened with parallel currencies that favor local exchanges, I saw this emerging in the self-electricity consumption, which when you produce your own electricity, you have a meter, you say, okay, everything that will be sent to the grid, I'll count it up. So either you've sold it to the grid and you've resold it to EDF in France, electricity agency, or you think that this energy that you produced at home, so you can use it, or maybe you can use it or elsewhere. So I understood that blockchain was unable of tracing, yes, this electricity is consumed elsewhere, and it's self-consumption. And this is the result of an algorithm through which you authenticate the originator. So this is good for the local consumption of electricity. That's absolutely essential, in fact. So we do not have a plan to be able to reply to your question. I can say all the applications, all the apps that are there we're thinking about haven't yet been finalized. The consumption of two connected objects can actually, through blockchain, highlight high level of connections and high level of consumption, rather. So you can trace them, make it legally possible to account for that. So how can you actually make sure that you keep a check on all that? We won't be able to do this within ADEME, but through various tenders to green tech or various other businesses. We can see what other businesses can suggest to us as a solution, a new algorithm or new exchange protocol that will enable us to sort of keep an eye on the actual consumption. But we can't really reply to that question. If you have an idea of the answer, let François know.
Yeah, blockchain is super sexy at the moment. Super sexy. London is absolutely stuffed with startups, as are other places in Europe, which are blockchain. So I think right now there's a bit of a bubble, and as often happens with these technologies, there's this sort of hype. Initially, a hype cycle. When people get overexcited, they can see that in the future things are going to be good, but they get overexcited, and then there's probably going to come a crash because we're going to find out that it takes a little bit longer than everyone thought. But once we've got through that, in the long term, blockchain is and that general space of technologies is going to really work. But one of the things that that's the problem at the moment is that these are very restricted technologies. The sort of quantity of data you can put through the blockchain is very small. So it may still take a while technically before we have the capability to do some of the really exciting things at the scales that really matter. They're very fundamental technologies, therefore you can do lots and lots of different things with them. But for me, what's most interesting is that it opens up the vista of, so again, looking, in my framework, my research, I see that digital does a number of things. It allows you to automate things, so you just get it to do stuff for you. It allows you to sort of augment yourself to be cleverer because you've got the whole of the internet plugged into your brain via your smartphone. It allows you to communicate with people through the wonderful world of social media and markets and things. But I think the place that the blockchain, the fourth place, is where the blockchain's really going to take off, is where I get to automate my interactions with other people. So I'm interacting with other people, but we're both doing it automatically. And it doesn't have to be blockchain. This is already happening on a huge way. Most of the trades that happen on the market happen from bots. And what blockchain opens up is the possibility for smart contracts, which are slightly terrifying ideas where you can lock yourself into a contract where you don't need a law, you don't need an authority to maintain that contract with someone else. It's entirely automated, so therefore it's not get-outable of it in any way. So that's going to be a whole new world where we're locked into these relationships with other people technologically and not legally. What does this mean for sustainability? Well, the big thing, I think, from that space, it's not necessarily blockchain, but from this automation of our interactions is the smart grid and the fact that we're going to have this distributed energy network where all the supply and demand points that are all around the place, some here renewable energy producing somewhere, reusing in other places, this distributed energy network is going to be controlled by lots and lots of bots, lots of agents, and they're all going to be connecting with each other and negotiating and trying to get the best price for the energy that they're producing or using or the storage capacity. So that's the sort of space. And generally, blockchain is good for producing markets, and there's lots of interesting markets in the sustainability space.
You wanted to add something, Miguel?
Very brief, you talk about automatization, and I also think, like, in a way, the invisible hand in the market is also a little bit of, or has been quite automatic, no? And maybe not for, for people that are in direct relationship, but at a higher level, it's quite automatic. For us, blockchain, So for us, blockchain, we just started a project. I mean, it's not necessarily going to use blockchain, but blockchain was kind of the trigger, obviously, which is on material traceability coming from mines. So this is work that just started. So we are now meeting with developers, but that allows for all this stuff that was happening automatically anyway, no? Of this very complex supply chain that very often we don't know where things come from. Actually, it can still happen automatically, but in a much more kind of controlled way and with traceability, with understanding how it works.
Ok, on a 5 minutes en plus. On va prendre une question au fond.
Another 5 minutes, last questions. I think there were quite a few at the back. Yes, hello.
Assez bref si possible.
Short, please. Short and sweet. We've been talking about the importance of digital and ecological transition under the shape of a convergence. Innovate, how should we do it? Rabelais said it in the 16th century. So it's the problem is that of public policies. We're talking about technologies, really. Digitally, on energy, waste, recycling. We've spoken a bit about meeting the meaning. We mentioned it with Venezuela. I'd like to know, through the public policies by states, for example, France, isn't it desirable that we should integrate the eco-conditionality of aid or the idea of circular economy in engineering training, the training of engineers. Maybe wouldn't it be a good idea to integrate this idea of meaning, the why we do things, because this sort of takes us to the whole purpose of our society. The energy ecological transition would be a way of linking, this would link it to the society's transition. So what are public policies doing, or what is being done, if anything? That's not an easy question to conclude our debate, really. François? Public policies, is there anything? We mentioned it before. So to be more specific on digital transition and ecological transition, first of all, you have to let people know about the impact of the various technologies. This is also part and parcel of the responsibility of governments. They have to enlighten their consumers, their citizens about, their fellow citizens about the choice they might have to make. So in order to do that, you have to develop the knowledge about the impact of certain behaviors and the empowerment of citizens. We have to develop research to find solutions for this technology. You have to, of course, realize that the digital revolution is an element that goes beyond borders, as we mentioned. It doesn't stop at borders. Who can control that? Who can actually keep a check on that? Governments are powerless, really. I'm not going against what you're saying, but in terms of public policies, I don't know how. It's not a question of prescribing which type of phone you're going to use. Maybe you could have rules on obsolescence, but you can see governments are really a bit powerless as to how to give some sort of framework to this digital revolution. So you have to do research, of course, and maybe you need imagination to think things out, politically speaking. Would you like to react, Edouard? It's more everything that is public. I think there was the idea of why can society uncover some sort of meaning.
So I'm a bit reluctant to say, what governments should do. They come from society in a democratic system, but it's its responsibility to organize public debates. And I believe that on environmental issues in particular, the COP21 in Paris was such a diplomatic state because, in fact, there was a lot of investment, not only from politicians, but NGOs and companies as well. And I believe that the impact was very strong. So for me, understanding these stakes in terms of energy transition in the country, obviously, not everything is perfect, but I believe that it's related. And you see that the debates on these issues are real society debates. And as I said before, in territories, we try and make sure that projects, have positive impacts so that we can go beyond caricatural reactions, because these are very complex issues. So what conclusion can we draw on digital transition? Once again, I believe that we're being more and more mature on dangers and advantages, and the CNIL has been existing for a while. So we try and act to make sure that these debates are real society debates. Because once again, as I said before, this is a democracy, and the whole society has to have these debates. Okay, thank you very much. We'll stop here. Thank you to all four of you. Thank you to all of you. It is 12:30. Well, we're 3 minutes late, but here you are. Thank you very much.